So I do. I really hope all of you enjoyed your lunch. And now let's jump back in with our next panelist, Ricky Houston. Ricky Houston is the Chief Program Officer at A Call to Men. Ricky is an experienced trainer working throughout the United States and for the U.S. State Department. He works with schools and organizations across the country to implement a call to men's lives, respect, and healthy masculinity curriculum. Come on, y'all, put your hands together for Mr. Ricky Houston. Our second panelist is Michael Shively. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's a research and policy expert with a 30-year career that focuses on efforts to prevent and respond to victimization, vulnerable populations. His research on the consumer level demands that drives all sex trafficking markets includes an evaluation of a program designed to deter sex buyers. Y'all put your hands together for Michael Shively. Our moderator for this panel is our very own Nikki Miller. Come on, y'all. Yeah, right there. So Nikki is the Director of Operations at Shield, North Carolina, and serves on the leadership team for the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. Nikki, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Chris. So I'm pretty excited. In our last panel, you heard about how important education was, and education in the lower grades, not just high school or college. So Ricky's going to tell us about the program that they're using at A Call to Men. And then also Michael is an expert in deterring buyers, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about buyer education type programs. So this panel is curricula. So let's get started. Ricky, we'll start with you. If you want to just kind of introduce yourself and tell us about your background with curricula.
Yeah, I'm Ricky Houston, Chief Program Officer with A Call to Men, and we really believe that curriculum is so important. You heard Tony really talk earlier this morning about engaging men to end men's violence against women, and really how demand fits into that. And when we think about violence, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, or human trafficking, it's learned behavior. It's learned behavior. And so those things that are learned can be unlearned. And so that's why curriculum is so important. And it's important to start at a very early age. And with our work at A Call to Men, with the work we were doing with working with professional athletes, working with the military, college athletes, working with men in all different spaces, that we decided that we take those lessons learned and begin to, where's the root of the problem? Where did this begin? And if you remember this morning, Tony showed the picture, the video of the little boy. And that's where it begins. And I think John said earlier that's the mouth, that's the beginning stages. So we said, so let's begin to engage boys at a very early age, because that's where the problem is beginning. And so in 2015-16, we developed this curriculum, Live Respect, and along with Scholastic, that we launched in 2016. And so we knew it was important to engage boys. And one of the things that we saw when we launched this curriculum, because we did pre and post tests, was that only 19% of boys, and these were middle through high school boys, different demographics all around the country, was private schools, public schools, charter schools, all different demographics, financial demographics. But one of the things that we found in common was only 19% of boys knew what consent was. Only 19% knew what consent was. Only 41% said that once they started sexual activity, the other person didn't have the right to change their mind. So when does it become rape once they stop? And so what we saw was when we did the curriculum and did the post test, we were able to flip those numbers. That's when we realized that curriculum is so very, very important. And the reason it's important too is we think about, and I know we talk about demand, but when we think about, and I know Tony talked earlier about feeling like we have the right to, one of the things was that only 19% or 81% of boys not knowing what consent meant. These boys in middle and high school, where do they go when they leave high school? They go to college, okay? Do we have a problem with sexual assault on college campus? I think so. You go to the military, do we have a problem in the military? Yes. Out here in general public, do we have a problem? So this is why we say it's so important that we use curriculum.
Michael, same question to you. If you could just tell us a little bit about your background with curricula.
All right, well, I'm an old guy, and when I was first, a student drawn to these kinds of problems like crime and violence and victimization, the thing that was front page then wasn't trafficking, it was rape, date rape, sexual assault, sexual violence. And this was in the early 80s, and it was really the transition from pretend it doesn't exist or blame the victim or kind of assume she's lying, which it was transitioning from there into take it seriously, listen, and doesn't matter if you're married, and doesn't matter if you know them, and all that. So I saw tremendous progress being made back then. And then the kind of front page thing in the early 2000s forward is, trafficking. That's what's, still more of a front page thing. But even in my earliest days, I remember looking at things like, campus safety and, rape crisis centers and all this. And it struck me as unjust and wrong-headed that the burden on fixing the problem is on the wrong people, which is the victims. You change your behavior. You better get spotted. You better get better at spotting the bad guys, And, if you get assaulted, you're supposed to go to the police, who back then were not nearly as good at responding. And it's like, wait a second, they're not the people doing this. People doing it are the guys who raped them, right? They're the problem. So, for a long time, I worked on sexual violence issues, and then I got into doing research on trafficking. My first project was a federally funded project back in 2003. And I had a continuous string of federally funded trafficking programs right up until last year. And I've done prevalence estimation. I've done both sex and labor trafficking. I did a project where I went into federal prisons and interviewed convicted traffickers. But the most of what I've done, and probably the main reason I'm here, is on demand. Who are the buyers? What can we do to stop them? What is the evidence that you actually can change the behavior of sex buyers? So, that's, I think, the most relevant stuff.
Do you want to tell them what you did?
Yeah, so one of the things, the people who got to me first, and I thank God for this all the time, is survivor leaders who educated me. And they're the ones who told me before I ever heard it from anyone else, it's about demand, it's about demand, it's about demand. You can find and rescue and patch up every abused person you can, and 2, 3, 4 weeks later, there's just going to be a whole new truckload of them, as long as you don't stop the behavior of the actual offenders, which are the buyers first and the sex traffickers right after that. So the framework that makes sense, and Norma Hotelling, who started this anti-trafficking program in San Francisco years ago, and one of the first and biggest John schools in the country, she's the one who, framed it as supply-demand distribution. Supply is the people that are exploited. Mm-hmm. The distributors are the traffickers, and now we also have the whole online world and all the platforms that are part of distribution. And then the buyers, they're the consumers, and they're the real drivers of the whole problem. And in public health, they use useful terminology, which is primary prevention, tertiary, and secondary prevention. And basically, what it boils down to is, are you dealing with the cause, the root, true cause, and you're trying to stop it from happening before it happens? That's primary prevention. That's what I'm about. That's back to the rapists and the kids, the college boys, right? No means no. Or are you just responding to it, which we need better responses, and don't take away from anything I say today or tomorrow saying we should do less for survivors, or we should do less to catch traffickers. We need to do more. But we also are never going to get ahead of this unless we get engaged in primary prevention, which is getting the sex buyers, catching them, and deterring them, and even more importantly, which is where his stuff comes in, the real brass ring, the long game, the real answer to stopping this is going upstream. Once they're buyers, they're already pretty late, and it gets harder to change it. If you can go earlier so that little boys don't grow up to be men who think it's okay to buy people, then you're talking like a real solution.
So true. So we've talked a little bit about why education and curricula is important. Who is the best target audience for this prevention?
One of the things, and I just want to go back to earlier, when we look at, Tony talked about all of us, when we look at the collective socialization of manhood. If you're male identified, when we look at public health language, we all are risk factors. So this, we're all swimming in the same water. Whether we perpetrate the violence or not, we've been taught we're part of that same collective socialization. So this curriculum, this message is for all men, it's for all boys. Going back to primary prevention, swimming upstream. Let's go up and see why people are drowning in the water. Let's swim upstream and see what's going on. It's part of that socialization, part of how we've been taught. And when we look at that socialization too is, think about media. And with our Live Respect curriculum, I've got copies on the back table back there. One of the things we talk about is the media aspect. What are some of the messages that we're getting from media? So when I think about the pictures of the 3 boys that we saw earlier, where are those boys learning manhood from? We saw the one guy here, maybe he's trying to do the right thing, but he has those older cousins or older kids at school who are talking about those things. But not only now, but media. When we look at cell phones, the things that we were privy to at such an early age, I think that was spoken about earlier in the policy legislation session. So what are they being taught, through media? What are they being taught through songs? What are the things that we're watching on TV? So that's why it's so important that we swim upstream. So we start having these, in the curriculum that we have is for middle and high school boys, but we do have another one for younger kids called Book of Dares. It was a book that we share with smaller kids. But when we think about the target audience, it's all of us. It's all of us. Is that, and hopefully everyone in here does not buy sex, but there's a possibility, it's out there. So if we begin to, one of the things I thought Tony was going to do earlier, but since he's not here, don't tell him I did it. But, I watched him some years ago. He said, my outstretched hands represent all men. There's only a small percentage of men who choose to be, whether it's sexually, physically, verbally, psychologically, mentally abusive. But then there's the rest of us. He said, but the question is, is about the rest of us. Okay, where do we stand? What is our relationship to these men here? And not only that, but these men here, they're counting on the rest of us to do what we've always done, and that's remain silent. So that's why we have to educate all men. One of the things that I was sharing with Jim earlier at lunch today is that when we first launched this curriculum, I was at a high school, and the coach invited us in to twice a week to work with their strength and conditioning classes. And so we were working with their football team twice a week, and the coach would sit in. And about the 4th lesson, the coach said, wow, I'm part of the problem. Even the language that I'm using with these boys are part of the problem. And so if we're just engaging with the kids and we're not working with adults, then they're going back into the same environment. So when we talk about who's the audience, all of us who are male identified, but then I should go a step farther. I think all of us need to be part of the audience. And the reason I say that too is, and I'm not blaming you, because we've taught you how to treat us in that man box. Let me say that again. We've taught y'all how to treat us in that man box. And so sometimes you can hear girls or tell a boy, oh, you're crying like a girl. Where did she learn that from? We taught you that. And so now we have to go back. And so the audience is everyone to need to hear this, so that we're not reaffirming or either, that's not the word I want to use, but perpetuating, with some of the same language, some of the same things. So we have to start new. We have to engage in a different way so that we can get a different outcome.
Do you have anything to add, Michael? Or
what he said.
Ditto.
And I'll just expand on it a little bit, which is the audience is everyone. If you're talking about buying sex, the perpetrators are way over 99% male. And so, it's men. And toxic masculinity is something that is a big thing, and it's got a lot of different facets. But even just the very, very narrow message, buying sex is a bad idea, right? we can go into details why, we can show evidence, we can, we can go down lots of rabbit holes, but if that's the message, everyone needs to hear that. And I'm a big fan of not reinventing wheels, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this and interviewing a lot of different experts, and I think a good strategic approach is think about where similar messages or close cousin messages are already being delivered. And think of places you can just add a bullet point or two, right? So, again, I was part of that generation where you went from not doing this to doing it, which is there isn't a college male student that doesn't hear the message going into a university, no means no, right? She says no, and then, here we got a form, it's affirmative consent form, right? They can really take it a lot of places, but that message is being delivered everywhere. If you can go college by college and say, can you add a bullet point, please? No means no, don't buy sex, right? And if you want to go further, like, pornography is a real bad thing for everyone, right? And here's why, right? Of course, they're going to say BS, right, and move on, but at least you plant the seed. You take your shot, right? So that's it's basically everywhere. If you think about any place where you talk about health and health ed and sex, bullet point or two, don't buy sex. It has bad consequences, right, for you and to everyone else. And you just keep going on and on. Civics, civil behavior, and just general respect for people and what consent means in a lot of different aspects. So that's the broad one. I'm going to add one little thing, though, that something that's a recent trend. Like, I've been tracking, it's turned into probably something diagnosable at this point in me, which is like 7 days a week, 365 days a year, I do web searches, and I'm looking for any sign that anywhere has done something about demand, right? And I've been doing this for over 15 years. And something that is definitely a trend is that if you go 2005 and earlier, 99.something% of the arrested sex buyers were trying to buy an adult policewoman, right? Now, I think it's well over half of the arrested sex buyers were trying to buy a child. And I don't think the nature of the business changed that much. It's the nature of policing, law enforcement, and awareness, and the web. Because to catch a sex buyer that's already there, it's not a kid you're trying to stop from becoming that, but they're already doing it. The only way something will ever hold up in court, you got a 22-year-old policewoman who looks like she's 18 and says she's 15. It's going to get blown out of the water in court. It's going to get defended, right? So you couldn't catch child predators with an adult policewoman on a street corner. But with the advent of online commerce, which is a bad thing, but you can use it. Now you can put an ad up that makes it clear they were young, and then you say she's 14 or 12. I know of cases of 4 and 8-year-olds that were bought, and now you can open up that thing. Now, that's a different animal, right? Like, if you're talking about someone who's trying to buy an 8-year-old, they're not going to be as responsive. It's a whole different ballgame. Now you're talking about something that profiles as sex offenders. They need sex offender treatment. You catch them, that's a serious felony. So it's a different thing. There's a lot of overlap that we can talk about. But then the other thing, like when we're talking about adults buying adults, then it's a different thing. It's not necessarily coming from pure pathology. There's a lot of social support for it. And the messaging can be much different. And your ability to leverage them, catch them, do things with them, force them into treatment, it's way different if you're talking about someone buying children versus someone trying to buy an adult. I took way too much time, but.
No, that's great, because you're talking about different ways to educate versus treatment, right?
Yeah, right.
There's some you can educate, and then there's some that just need treatment. Okay, so Ricky, as Chief Program Officer to A Call to Men, you've trained thousands of men to think outside of the man box. And I think we covered, and Tony covered this morning, how thinking inside that man box can feed into human trafficking. So can you tell me how you're engaging boys the same way through your Live Respect program?
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing right now also is that when we talk about healthy manhood, one of the things, and you said earlier, is that asking for help is a sign of what? Y'all said it earlier, weakness. And so we're trying to shift that with the curriculum to let them know that it's okay to ask for help, that no person is an island. It's okay to ask for help, because when we do that, it reminds me when I think about our mental health, the mental health impact of not being able to ask for help. My mother, God rest her soul, lost her 2 years ago, but she used to have this pressure cooker. Now they call them Instant Pots. I think they just put a little digital thing on it, but pressure cooker with the steam come out the top. What happens if you close off that top where the steam can't come out? It explodes, right? And so when we think about kids not being able to express their true emotion like this boy in this picture, can't ask for help, can't talk about what's really going on. And now, especially with the work I'm doing on college campuses, but also we're bringing it back to our high school and middle schools, there are a lot of men who are dealing with loneliness. A lot of men who are dealing with rejection, but we can't talk about it. And so how do we cope with it? When we're dealing with loneliness and rejection, then maybe that coping skill may be buying sex. So that leads to trafficking. What if that person is getting rejected all the time? So buying a body, I can't be rejected, it gives me some control. So when we go back to the curriculum, how we're working that is when we engage in boys at a very early age, we're teaching them how to break outside of that man box. But also we're teaching them what consent is. We're teaching them about gender roles as well, because oftentimes we've been taught about gender roles, even with the video we saw earlier. How do we respond differently to our daughters than we do our sons? And so, and even with media, when we look at now with our government, we see things are shifting. We see, even in the medical, years ago, we could say doctor, automatically we said a man. Said a nurse, we automatically said, was a woman. So we're looking at gender roles now. So those things that we're teaching in the curriculum, but not only that, but we're talking about not only consent and non-consent, but coercion. What do those conversations look like around coercion? Because some of those times we never hear about coercion. We're talking about boundaries as well. So all those things are engaging, especially young boys at an early age, gives them that opportunity to talk about what's really going on, to build those relationships. For example, Michael and I, we could have the weight of the world on our shoulders, and we'll go drink the bar dry and never talk about what's going on, because I don't want him to think, yeah, exactly. But now, y'all may go have a glass of wine and say, hey, this is what's happening in my life. So we have to get men to the place, so we're trying to get boys to develop a place where you're developing those relationships, where you can have those honest conversations, where you don't have to keep things bottled up inside. One of the things too, and sometimes I use different analogies. If I'm with a football team, especially high school and middle school, we have, I say and I'll pull a running back to the front of the room and say, I'm giving you this ball, and I'm the quarterback. I've called a play, straight up the middle, what are you gonna do? And they say, automatically, I'm going to get a touchdown. And I say, no one is gonna stop him, right? And the defense, someone always come up and say, defensive line, like, no, we've got it. I said, but what if you miss him? Linebacker say, no, we've got it. But what if y'all miss him? Then safeties and cornerbacks say, oh, we got it. I'm dealing with high schoolers, you know what? And they understand that on that football field, there are things, mechanisms in place to stop that person there from scoring. But when we get to the relationships or things that I'm doing, or if I'm talking about buying sex or watching porn in the locker room, then no one challenges me on that. So when we saw those pictures earlier, when we saw those 3 little boys, we can take that person out front. How do we engage him? Because we want to engage that leader. How can we change his mind so that when someone is talking about porn or showing porn, then we're not calling somebody out, but we're calling them into a conversation. Notice what I said, we're not calling them out, but we're calling them in. I think too often we call out, but a call to men, we like to call in and have a conversation. Not beat up on someone, not indict you, but invite you into this conversation so we can teach you what healthy masculinity is all about. So those are some of the things that we're doing with the curriculum, where we engage in boys at an early age, and oftentimes it's freeing. It's freeing because now I can be my true, authentic self. I don't have to hide behind that mask. And so that's the work that we're doing with the curriculum.
So making mental notes. Okay, so know your audience, right? You gave examples of the football teams. Use examples they can relate to. Talk about gender roles, consent. You also mentioned coercion, and I'm curious, how do you approach that in your curricula? What are some examples you might provide, especially at that age?
Well, one of the lessons in the curriculum, we've got, and we'll use a PowerPoint for it, and we'll put it up on the board and give the kids handouts. But we've got 3 columns: consent, non-consent, coercion. And we got different statements, that we've got in this box. and they get a chance to listen to the statement or read the statement and put it on the white box, because coercion can be kind of tricky at times when we're trying to convince, and we like to define coercion, and we like to let the students define it as well, and talk about to try to convince someone. And so when we talk about consent, also we teach that consent is ongoing. Also about checking in, it can be ongoing. And just because someone gave you consent today doesn't give you all ongoing consent. And so, but the coercion piece is really key. But also with the non-consent, it could be, and we know we say the yes is the verbal yes, but what stiff body language? What does that mean? So we're talking about all those different things. Someone didn't say no, that doesn't give you consent. And so we define between those consent, non-consent, but coercion. And it's so important to give, we give them examples of what coercion is, but also invite them to bring their own, statements and phrases, because we like to impact culture with culture. And what I've learned is the youth can teach me a lot. And so sometimes having conversations my kids, they're still in their 20s, and so I can reach out to them sometime and find the ongoing lingo, because I got a little snow on the roof now.
Listen,
so
right?
yeah, I have to listen sometime so that I can reach and engage them.
And what kind of impact is it having on these kids? Are you seeing any results or any examples you can?
Yeah, so we're seeing some major results. As a matter of fact, we just launched our HMP, our Healthy Masculinity Project, 2 years ago, moving into 3 years now. And with the HMP, our goal was that we had a funder who funded it for us to reach 20 organizations in year one. And we gave each organization $10,000 each to do our Live Respect curriculum. But they had benchmarks they had to meet along the way. And we have an evaluator at Georgia State University who came up with the pre and post test. So we evaluated the curriculum. But not only reaching at least 25 male-identified youth, but also, here's the caveat, they had to reach also 25 adults in their community as well. And the reason we wanted to reach adults is because we didn't just want to reach the youth and they go back in those environments, but we wanted to impact the community as well. The youth had to be male identified, but the adults, we wanted, any gender for the adults to make an impact in that, within the community. And we saw huge shifts even with the adults. They have to go through what we call the breaking out of the man box training. We saw a huge shift with the adults. We've watched, and I've got Joshua back there, the program manager for the Healthy Masculinity Project, and we've watched, looking at some data that's coming in from this year already, some great data last year, from about 20 to 25% knowing what consent meant, or knowing how to engage a peer around language. It went from like 22% to like 87%. So we're watching numbers, and we probably next year release a lot of our findings, but we're watching numbers just really making a huge impact. But sometimes the impact is that even in conversations, there was a year one, there was a church school in Conyers, Georgia, I think it was, and they had half of their adults went through a virtual online training without breaking out a man box training. And the principal asked me if I could come to Atlanta and, on a Saturday morning, and I was like, yes, I will, to do the other half of their adults. And halfway through the training, this man was just really excited about it. He said, wow, what type of impact is it making? And there was a mom in the group who said, hey, can I answer that? And she said, my son is going through this curriculum now. And she said, just last week, I told his little brother to stop crying like a girl and go outside and play. He said, and my son told me, he said, Mom, you in the man box. So what's wrong with him showing his emotion? What's wrong with him feeling how he truly feels? And why does he have to be a girl just because he's crying? So all of a sudden, this little boy began to educate his mom about some of the things that he was learning through the curriculum. So we like to have those stories like that to be able to share also. We're seeing a lot of facilitators talking about how they have changed, about even how they're talking with the kids, because they're learning so much from the curriculum as well. So we know it's not only impacting the kids, but it's also impacting the adults as well. And I think, Micah, that's where we really get into. That's when we think about reducing demand, is that how do we begin at a very early age so that boys know at an early age that it's not okay to buy sex? That it's, when we think about how we treat women. I was doing some work for Major League Soccer one year, and I'll be quiet so you can talk. But and I was doing their spring trainings, and I was in a city that my daughter lived in at the time. And I asked all those players, I said, my daughter lives in this city. I said, if you met my daughter today, how many of you would respect her? And every hand went up, yes, Mr. Houston, yes. I'm like, I never showed you a picture of my daughter. You don't know what she looked like. So in order for that to take place, that means you have to respect every woman you came in contact with. That's the place where we're getting to. Because if we can get there, then that's how we reduce the demand.
That's so inspiring, especially for people in the room that do training, to kind of hear these pointers and understand that it is working. Something that Tony did, and I noticed it sounds like it's a big part of the Live Respect training too, is to be engaging with your audience, right? Be engaging, especially with kids. You know, you learn their language, their little the words they use and the slang, and then you use it back with them. And so it's good. Making mental notes, because at SHIELD we do a lot of training. I have more questions for you, but I do want to give Michael some time too. So, Michael, when did people first become interested in addressing the buyers and training them, giving them some education, and then what have you seen kind of since then?
So the modern effort, you know, like if you look at recent history, in the 70s and 80s, it started picking up some steam. When people think about sex buyer education, almost anyone you ask that had ever heard of a John School would say, oh, the first one was in San Francisco. Well, it wasn't. It was probably the biggest, most famous one, and it really was very successful. And most of the ones that came after it used it at least as kind of a starting point to figure out what they wanted to do in their community. But it goes way back. Like, you know, I did some digging, and if you go back into the teens in some cities, it was really part of the temperance movement. There were some statements that would sound pretty enlightened today. There were people that would, you know, they would go and, without any laws against it, really, it was just sort of like repugnant or a nuisance or something like that. There were these red light districts in a lot of cities around, you know, all around the U.S. And it's like, well, they're trying to stamp out alcohol. Well, gee, look at the brothels, right, that are also bars. Like, let's round them up. And you find people, a lot of them were these like housewife coalitions, to say, wait a second, the guy's breaking the same law, right? You know, I mean, why don't we arrest the men? And they would. There were some in the teens. Arresting the buyers really in the 60s and 70s, it really started. Actually, the National Organization for Women sued the state of California for unequal enforcement of the law. And so then they had to start arresting some of the men, or else they were just going to get sued again for gender discrimination. Educating them, I can trace it back to about 1980. The first thing that we would call a John School, which is a phrase I got to talk about for a second. Almost nobody likes it, right? It just like rubs people the wrong way. I keep using it because then people know what you're talking about, and it's actually in a lot of state laws that'll make reference to it. So, you know, I'll keep saying it, but a reporter coined it at around 2004 or 5, and it just kind of stuck, right? So here we are. Just like reverse sting, it's actually kind of, wait a second, shouldn't the default be going after the buyers, you know, instead of like, well, it's the other thing, like, you know, I've had those discussions. But educating sex buyers, 1980, Grand Rapids, Michigan, they started a thing where if they were going to arrest a buyer, they had to go sit, the probation department ran it. And it wasn't voluntary, they didn't get their charge dismissed, but they just had to, you know, just go do that, go listen to this. You know, there are about 240 cities and counties that have ever, maybe they don't still, but have ever used a John School, which is a little bit different saying how many John Schools are there. There are maybe 70, 75 different programs, but some of those programs serve multiple communities, right? But, you know, of the 70 or 80 John Schools that we've ever had, you know, they start in 1980. They picked up steam around 1995, which is when the San Francisco program started. One of the very few pennies the federal government has ever spent on demand reduction was bringing people to San Francisco to learn how their John School program worked, and then the hope was they would go back to their communities and start their own. And 6 out of the 8 cities that went did. So, you know, I don't know if it's a separate question, but talk about the curriculum, what the speaking points are, and what they look like. So, you know, I can go on, and I will. Probably I'll talk about it more tomorrow. I hope that's not a disincentive for showing up tomorrow. But you know, I can talk a lot about the curriculum. I did a project where I did a lot of work to try to gather information about these programs. And most of what I'll talk about I have on a website, and you know, I'll show you the address. You can go just find this stuff. But you know, we gathered curricula. And then I went and I sat in a lot of John School programs. You know, I sat in myself like 8, and my team did several more. And I sat through 2 years of the San Francisco John School program, just making observations about it. So I can, you know, talk in detail about the nature of the curriculum, the kind of messaging, and what they say. But the last thing I'll say before I'll stop right now is, it's kind of back up a bit and go broader, which is this whole conversation about broader messages, not the known buyers that you've arrested, but the broader messages. And just one important point I just want to make sure we said before this is over is, the reason, you know, one of the reasons to talk to everyone, and actually not just men, about these things, like what is toxic masculinity, what is wrong culturally that makes men grow up to be the perpetrators of so many awful things, all that good stuff. We need to talk to people that are possibly bystanders and enablers and things like that. And we know that there are some kind of culturally accepted free passes, right? Things like bachelor parties. You know, a guy that would never in a million years think of going to a bar or a street corner online and buying someone for prostitution. Maybe it's sort of okay, or at least it's more okay. Well, it's you know, it's their bachelor party, so they go to Vegas, right? And that's part of what they do. Now I know it's repulsive probably to this, you know, everyone in the room, but we know it's true. We know that this is a cultural thing where there's a little, it's kind of a free pass you get on that one day. These conversations we need to have about what is and is acceptable. It's one thing for, you know, charismatic, articulate people to roll in and say a bunch of good crap, right? You know, and then to, you know, to do all these classes. But people live day to day, minute to minute with their peer groups, right? And what you really want is to plant people in male peer groups that have gotten the message, which is like, what do you want to do? I don't know, I'm bored, we did this, we did that, you know. Strip club comes up. Men in groups and boys in groups, they get real stupid. One guy actually gave me a formula. He said, if you want to do the collective IQ of a group, you find the stupidest guy, get his IQ, and divide it by the number of guys in the group. Right? So the dumbest guy's got an 80, and there's 4 of them, so that group IQ is 20. Right? And, you know, it's kind of just for fun, but there's something there, and what you want is to have one guy in the peer group say, it's just a bad idea. Maybe they don't even explain it, but they just say, I'm not gonna, right? You want to get the ball rolling in a different direction. Mothers, wives, you know, there are guys who take their boys to a brothel to get them to learn how to have sex, right? Sometimes women will go along with it. Like, I don't know how to teach a boy to be a boy. Usually they don't. Usually, you know, there's something else going on. But it's just so important to hit both things. Like, the guys that are currently known sex buyers, you got to thump them, you got to catch them, you got to try to teach them. There's a bunch of things you can do. But when you go upstream, the broader the better. And it's to try to get these conversations led not by people like us, but by peers.
That's why it's so important to engage that leader in the group. Because if you have that leader who is positive, so often, that's what I talked about loneliness earlier, so often there are many people in the group that don't want to go alone, but they're looking around. We're permission seekers. We're permission seekers. If you remember that picture, there was one kid, the kid on the left, he was just, you know, he was looking at the guy in the middle to see, you know, what is he going to do. So that's what I was saying. If we can engage that guy in the middle, begin to think positive, some, you know, give him the right messaging, then that's how we can really, really make a difference. But I so agree with you, because when we think about rites of passage sometimes, you know, taken to a brothel, when we think about, even with, hazing rituals. So how do we shift that? How do we get, and one of the lessons that I forgot to mention in the Live Respect curriculum is objectification. We talk about, objectification. So how do we move to the place where a woman's body is not an object, mainly a sexual object? And so those are some lessons that we have to teach at a very early age.
I want to go back to the buyer education programs for a minute. I hate the term John School too. So how do you, I guess, are there any effective ones? And if so, how do you determine effectiveness? And then what are the characteristics? Like if you've seen 6 effective ones, what are the characteristics of those 6 that you think make them effective?
All right, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to start this answer with the story. It's a story of me doing an evaluation of a John School program. And then I'll talk about other ones. But what happened was I was working at a private research company. We competed for a grant to evaluate the San Francisco John School program. We ended up winning it. And when I started it, I didn't really have a dog in the hunt. I didn't have an opinion, really. I just thought, okay, let's find out what this is about, right, and see if it works. And once I found out what the program was about, I remember coming back to my team after visiting it and getting their curricula and getting all their information and sitting in on one. I just thought, okay, there's no way this thing's like affecting recidivism. But it may be a good idea to do it for a lot of other reasons. And we were stuck with trying to evaluate it, but I was sure. I mean, I would have said with great certainty, it is not going to change these guys, right? And one of the problems I had was that I was extremely well educated on offender treatment programming. And there's a collective wisdom and a ton of research, mountains of research saying for treatment of offender populations, including drug offenders, sex offenders, batterers, a lot of different things, it needs to do A, B, C, D, and E. It needs to be responsive to individual risk needs. It needs to be intensive. You can't just go in and talk to them once. It needs to be sustained. One day, one time, things don't work. You have to sustain it. And you have to have aftercare, right? And everyone knows that, right? So we went there, and it's like a one-day program in San Francisco. They had 6 or 8 different curriculum items, depending on the day. They would, someone would talk about health risks, right? Okay, guy, you guys in the room, you 30 or 40 guys who got arrested, we're going to tell you the risks you're taking for yourself and also for your other partners, right? Legal risks. Okay, you got into this program and it's because you're a first-time offender. Next time you won't be so lucky, so here's what can happen to you legally. Cops would come in and say, look, here's what we see on the street for sex buyers. You're vulnerable. You are very vulnerable to the streets and the pimps and all kinds of things. And here's some horror stories about what's happened to Johns or buyers. Right? So anyway, there's all these different things. The star attraction, the thing everyone sat up and listened to was survivors. And it's a good thing, because they, if a program's going to work, most of it's probably attributable to them. And man, these guys paid attention. They didn't agree with everything, but they were listening more than anything else. So, 6 or 8 different curriculum items, but it's one day, no aftercare, and all the guys got exactly the same thing. Right? So I came back, told my team, this ain't going to do anything. And we're not going to find a statistical effect on recidivism, right? But what else can we learn about it, right? So we crunched the data, and we had amazing data from the state of California. I'll talk a bit more about it tomorrow. I'll show you kind of some things tomorrow, like a chart. But we came away with this finding from the data, and we had more than 1.3 million arrests of sex buyers throughout the whole state of California. We had more than 10,000 pre- and post-program just in San Francisco, and we could compare what we found in San Francisco pre- and post-program with any other city we wanted in the whole state. Amazing data. And we found that it cut recidivism in half. It went from 8.8% to 4.5%. And we thought, this is a mistake. There's no way it could do that, right? And we looked and looked and thought and thought and looked and looked and thought and thought, and we eliminated all the other explanations, and the one left standing is that the program did what it was trying to do. It actually changed the guy's behavior. We could rule out displacement to other places and all this. So we found this tremendous positive effect, right? The thing is, like, the conditions to do that study don't exist anywhere else. And I've tried, and I've looked, and you can't do the kinds of analysis we could do, and it's not because we're smart, it's because the data were there. But there are plenty of other things that have happened with sex buyer intervention programs quickly. In the UK, they started a program where they were arresting and then sending all the arrested guys into a John School program. Where they did that, recidivism fell, or not recidivism, the evidence of the problem on the streets, the number of women that were on the streets and all that, it went down by 40%. Buffalo, New York they looked at calls for service. If you got a prostitution problem, it isn't, that isn't dependent upon enforcement like arrest rates are. So calls for service are a pretty good indicator of what the community is experiencing. They had arrests plus John School in Buffalo, and calls for service about prostitution fell over 30%. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, what they did is arrested sex buyers, and then they put their identities in the Sunday paper every week. They would arrest 60, 70, 100 men in a weekend, put their names in the papers, right? That isn't necessarily education, that's outing them, but it's overlaps. The number of prostituted people that they could identify, they knew were working in the city, fell by 75%. So over and over and over, different indicators, including Newark, New Jersey, they had a true randomized experiment that was in the top peer-reviewed journal in all of criminal justice. And there they found that Newark was, I think it was 70% reduction in street prostitution when they arrested the buyers and not just the women, right? So over and over again, you see you need to intervene, you need to arrest, you need to out them, and you need to educate them. And the studies that have been done show that it works. Now, there's a few studies that don't, but none of them had good methodology. And they did like a pre-post survey, and they kind of made some stuff up. But where you had outcomes, you find that it works. Now, the San Francisco program, we could actually separate out the educational component from everything else. And again, you found a 50% reduction in recidivism. So they work. And before I move on, I'm just going to say one thing. It is so interesting to me as a researcher that's looked at law enforcement practices, education programs. I've looked at victimization. I've looked at prevalence. I've looked at traffickers. And I've interviewed convicted traffickers. And when you talk about going after traffickers, if you talk about identifying and helping victims, you talk about any other approach to try to deal with sex trafficking, no one asks about research. They'd say, it'd be great if we had better numbers. It's like, yeah, do we have a prevalence estimate? Then they move on and they go ahead and do it. But when you talk about demand, everyone's just thirsty for research. And then once you show them research, they become research methodologists and methodological critics, right? So we got this study, we put it out there, everyone's reading it and stuff. A couple people, like they publish a rebuttal. Ooh, they didn't randomize, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. Boy, everyone's a critic. So I'm just endlessly fascinated by this idea that we care about, when we try to stamp out trafficking, no one ever cares about the research on any other piece of it. On the demand stuff, they do, and I think what it speaks to is this inherent reluctance to really go after this. There's just this idea that, yeah, they're not really the problem. It's just the devil with the pitchfork and the horns, that's the trafficker. And then the victim's the victim, and we, obviously want to help them. But the buyers, they're just schmucks, right? They're kind of caught up in this stupid stuff too, but they're not really the problem. I think that belief runs pretty deep, and it's why people sit on their hands, and you show them research saying it works, and there is no comparable research that says awareness programming or victim rescues or going after traffickers. You can't find anything that says that stops the problem. Anyway, that's my
That is
little
a
rant.
great point, great point. And I will admit, although I am not scared to go after the buyer, so to speak, I all of a sudden became a research expert when I saw these numbers, and like he was talking about. And so I asked him, well, how do you know that recidivism was reduced? Because maybe they're just not getting caught again. And I want you to provide the explanation specific to that study for all those in the audience who might be thinking the same thing.
Okay, so, recidivism is not the perfect tool for finding out if people stop doing something, right? I mean, there's a big difference between continuing to do something and getting caught doing something, right? But we do know they're related, right? We do know, if it stands to reason that if the numbers that you caught go down by half, probably the same number of people continuing to do it is probably not happening, right? Something's going on there. Now, one of the explanations that we got asked and we pursued it was maybe they just are better at avoiding it, right? Maybe they just learned something that's like, I'm going to avoid it, right? But the problem here is this. If you look at the 10 years running up to it, so for 10 years, thousands of cases, arrested sex buyers, they recidivated at a very constant rate, 8.5%, 8.8%, right? Now the only thing you've changed is you've added this education program. And I'll show you the chart tomorrow. Bam, it just plummets straight down. And for 10 years, it squiggles at that low rate. The only thing that changed was the educational element, right? Now, getting arrested is the thing that really is bothersome, right? You kind of sit through a stupid class, right? They're just like, I'll do it if I have to, right? So, why would they be terrified of the education program, right? It makes some sense that they would learn something. Another thing is displacement. And again, we actually had the names and dates of birth of over 1 million men in California, and we knew their residence, and we knew where the arrest occurred. It was amazing that we had this data. And we could look at arrest at time 1 in California for 10 years prior to this program, so in San Francisco, and then throughout the rest of it, is that second arrest for the guys that did get caught again, where was it? So if they've all moved to Oakland or San Jose because, I don't like what I had to do in San Francisco, you should have been catching them there if you were catching them. That didn't happen. There was also another program, I didn't spend much time talking about this, but San Diego started a program modeled on the San Francisco one 10 years later. They started in 2005. The pre-post data looked very similar. It went down by more than 30% there, right? So, again, no matter what you have, you're not going to satisfy people who just don't want to believe it. That's fine. But again, compared to anything else, like if you believe that, going after traffickers is going to solve the problem, fine, show me the research. Show me the pre-post, like we didn't go after them, now we do. Show me the percentage decrease. There's nothing.
Awesome, thank you. So how can we, once we develop this wonderful program, how can we ensure sustainability?
So, buy-in is a big thing, right? And the one thing that you have to have, and this, it's a point I'll make again tomorrow, the key to this stuff, if you're talking about arrested sex buyer programs, right, not just general education of the public, but if you're talking about guys you arrest, you have to have prosecutors on board. Prosecutors are the linchpin, right? I've seen it a million times. The cops know what to do, and they want to do it, and they understand it. In fact, other than survivors, the people who get this better than anyone are your vice unit cops and your patrol officers. They see it, they understand it, they know the buyers drive the problem. And they've been leading the charge in trying to go after the buyers. But I've seen John schools that were good looking and they took them seriously. I've seen them close up shop because the cops quit making arrests, right? And a lot of times it isn't that they just lost religion on demand reduction or you got dumb or anything. It's that the prosecutor said, stop sending me those cases. And it could be a resource thing. Something else is going on, I know in Tampa, a state legislator's kid got killed in a drunk driving accident. In Tampa, they said, we're going to focus on drunk drivers. So the same kind of units that would have gone after, you know, the street prostitution, now they're trying to catch drunk drivers, right? You know, I'm not going to judge the cops or blame them, but it's like the prosecutors, you know, if they say, give me those cases and we will prosecute them, cops will keep making arrests, right? And cops cannot afford to waste their time making a bunch of arrests that are going to go nowhere and get thrown out of court. So if you have, for John School to work, what you need is a prosecutor that'll handle the cases, and you need police that'll make arrests. The rest is pretty easy, you know, and it varies tremendously. They are structured different ways. Some of them are literally 2 hours in one day. Some of them are 8 hours. Some of them are 10-week weekly programs, right? I mean, some of them are mandatory. Some of them are set up as voluntary. You know, you get your charge dismissed or reduced or something. The curriculum item's different. Who speaks in them? Like it can be all over the map that deals with whatever resources you have and whatever needs you have locally. So there's no dictate about how it has to be done. But the one thing that needs to happen is, like, if you don't have cops making arrests and they're going to follow the lead of the prosecutors, then you have nobody to populate these programs, and everyone dissipates and goes on to different things. So that's what you need to have. Now, the other thing is money. And I know I'm sucking all the oxygen out of the room, sorry, but these things, these John School programs are either free or revenue positive. Like San Francisco had over 7,000 men went through their John School program, and taxpayers did not pay 1 cent. In fact, it was revenue positive, and they raised over $3 million, and $1 million of that went directly into victim services, right? So, you know, if someone comes to you and says, hey, you know what, we got something for demand reduction, it'll probably cut your problem in half, it's not really risky, you have the resources to do it, you have the laws to do it, and in fact, not only is it free, but you'll make some money that you can use to solve other parts of the problem. Sound any good to you? Right? And it's a John School.
Easy to get by in that way.
Even if wrong, the data's wrong and all that, it's not going to hurt, right? You know, and if it's revenue positive or free, you know, why not? But it's amazing the amount of resistance you get to it. And I think it comes back to, if you just don't want the problem to go away because you're making money off the problem, or you feel good about yourself because you get to monkey with the problem and feel like a hero, or, you know, you just are a buyer and you're part of the problem, and you want to block efforts to stop what you think is a good thing, you know, there's all kinds of reasons why there's resistance.
Our final question is for you, Ricky.
Yeah, don't ask me another one.
So I was talking with Chief Rohoff actually at lunch today, and we were talking about how difficult it is to get an education program into the schools, or how to have them allowed or allow us to come into the schools. So are you seeing that challenge? And if so, how are you getting past that?
It's a huge challenge all around the country. All around the country, not just here in North Carolina, but it's a huge challenge. And there are times where we work with school systems, you know, things within the MOUs that we have to work with. Here in North Carolina, there's a 3-letter word that's a bad word. Anytime you mention that, it makes it tough, the word sex. Yeah, and so it makes it hard to get in. And we do have some organizations that are already in schools that maybe use our curriculum, and I say that's kind of a side door approach. But to really to look at reducing demand, this should be a curriculum or something like it that should be used in the schools. Because even though the John program is good, I want for law enforcement to really work on the things that law enforcement should be, not having to worry about, you know, the arrest they have to do. Because if we can change the mindset, we need the John schools now. But if we can I was looking at our tagline, the next generation of manhood. So that we can change the mindset where we're not, so we don't see women as objects, where we don't see kids as objects, that we're not buying people. And then we don't need the John schools, we need law enforcement to make an arrest. And so you said education, where you saw the numbers go down. So education is key. Those curriculum, whether it's our curriculum or other prevention curriculum, they are the key. But we need the John schools now to educate. But what you're showing is the education is bringing about awareness, it's making a difference. What we're seeing with our curriculum it's making a difference. And so what we're doing now is taking the data from each year. We did 20 schools the first year, 32 this past year, launching another 40 around the country now. But taking that data and showing how that's beginning to work, and now more principals. And now, not only are we getting calls from principals, I'm actually working with, just Monday, from a person in Connecticut who worked with a couple of high schools to take the curriculum in. Now the correction facility want to use the Live Respect curriculum. So you can take that and use it for adults as well. Short story, and Heather sitting by there, we were all doing a virtual training one night. And it was a program in Chicago, and they was using some men who had offended, had spent time in prison to now to be community influencers, going back and working with kids on the streets. And there were about 3 men on that night when we did our Breaking Out of the Man Box training, who were in tears. And they was like, if we would have had something like this when we were kids, then maybe I probably would have never spent time behind bars. And so they saw the need for it, and to really go out within their community, and begin to implement the curriculum as well. So it's been tough getting in some schools, but we're seeing, but with the data, data open doors sometimes. But the next thing is too, is that oftentimes when we see shortage of teachers, who are those people who are going to implement those curriculum as well? We do train the trainer, but who are those people? And sometimes we have to really rely on either school counselor or either school social workers. But we see a shortage of school social workers. Now have to work between several schools. They see the need. So we're actually looking for community champions. Who are the volunteers in that community that can really kind of go in? Because there's enough with teachers already. But we have to really do, for it to really, really work, not only do the kids of the school need to go through the curriculum, but staff and administration need to go through as well. So that they can really, so things that we're putting in place, that they're really, enforcing those things also. But they're not the ones who are reinforcing negative behavior. As I said, the coach said earlier, you know what, I'm guilty with the language that I use working with the players.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think that's our time. We might have gone over a little bit. Sorry about that. I'll turn it back over to you, Chris. Thank you to our panelists.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, man, you were good.
Ricky and Michael, thank you for that. Can I ask a question before we go to the break? Can I ask a quick question? The John School is done after a person is arrested, right? They become a John, right? Am I right about it? Help me.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be. Like, you could set up programs where, and there are some guys here and there that get referred by a counselor or by something, and most programs that are set up for arrested buyers, they'll take other people. But for the most part, it's 99% of all the guys that go through it, they've been either court ordered or they volunteered, and it was after the point of arrest.
Okay, I'm sorry I had y'all sit back down, but
I think I have an old program up here.
yeah, you had some more time. That's what I thought. So let me ask one more then while we're here. So if the John School is effective as you say it is, and you've done the data, and some people ain't coming against your data, I'm one not coming against your data. I believe in your data and what you said. I was listening. If it's that effective, is there something that it could be called something different so men can get this training before becoming a John? Is there some thought into putting in that to help to change it?
Yeah, so there was a program, the first one I know about was called CASE, and it was out of Chicago. It was Coalition Against Sexual Exploitation. And they developed a curriculum that was really, pretty much the same speaking points, about, buying sex and how harmful it is. And it, again, it isn't just to the people being bought, but it's also to the buyer and anyone around the buyer. So, and they were working, and this was around 2005, 6, 7, 8, right there. They were trying to get it into schools. And, they kind of got it in as a pilot and things like that. But, Ricky's going to know a lot more about, pulling this off. But it's really the same idea. It's the same basic points. You teach about harm and you teach about risk. And you try to do some more pro-social message about how instead of having a healthy, human, productive relationship that's real, you're doing this thing as kind of a fallback, and it's not good for anyone, including you, and you're really not getting your needs met. Those sort of like more positive messages, that's what these guys are all about, so.
Okay, do you want me to ask the question? That since I'm up here, you want?
Does anyone have a question?
Any questions in the far back there? I'll run for you. I was getting sleepy anyway. I'm coming, stay back there. You messing up my exercise.
Hello, you guys. My name is Shawnee Sconyers, and I'm an advocate with the One More Child program. We're an anti-trafficking mobile team here in the Triangle. And I'm wondering, with the vast and dynamic things that you all have discussed today, the thing that kind of sticks out is like education, prevention, and I'm always thinking as a social worker, like, hey, it all starts at home. So what components of like adverse childhood experiences do you all have within your programs?
One of the things we look at is, we always say we do our work at a call to men through an intersectional lens, and we have to really deal with the whole person. Even with our Live Respect curriculum, we talk about what we call that cycle of violence. And not only the cycle of violence, but the cycle of consequence of what we talk about. And depending on what that child has been through at a very early age, what are those factors? You know, the community they live in. When we think about what we call the race, sex, class construct, you know, that person of race, you know, the trauma that they're dealing with there. So many things that can impact that. So what are those things that is impacting that kid as well? And so when we're working with boys, especially is when we're talking this man box, can't ask for help. All those things are, you know, can't ask for help. How did that show up? Okay, stagnation. Now I'm left behind in school. I'm dealing with, and then I'm dealing with all those traumatic experiences that I don't really know how to talk about because the man box teaches me that I can't ask for help. Not only does it teach me I can't ask for help, but I can't offer help and I can't accept help. And so now, what are some of the other aspects that may happen? I may get it within the criminal system, and oftentimes we're not taught how to really look at trauma-informed care. So often is we see what this kid is doing, or even for that person who may be buying sex, rather than saying what happened to that person. You know, what are some of those factors that took place? And so we talk about that cycle of consequences as well, and how that impact that. Those when we look at what we call those ACEs scores, how does this childhood impact that? We know that 80% of boys who grew up in homes where abuse was present, 80% of abusers grew up in homes where abuse was present. So we know that many things can be true at once. Just because I grew up in that home doesn't necessarily I'm gonna be that person, but look at what I've seen. And so when we come back to education again, that's why curricula is so important. Because as I said earlier, those things, that's learned behavior. I mean, I've seen this happen here. I'm seeing it happen in my community. When we think about the social ecology model, you know, we look at the personal, the communal, the societal, you know, all those things. And so how does that shape one person? So that's why it's so important that we have that curriculum so we can change some of those dynamics so they can be unlearned. But that's such a great question when we look at ACEs school, when we look at how trauma shows up in that. You know, what have been some of the community factors that have impacted that person?
Any other questions?
I know we talk a lot about education, which is extremely important, and data does show that apparently, so that's awesome. But one of the things that I'm here for is the fit, loving parent that doesn't have the resources and education. And I'm hearing a lot about how we're targeting public education and things like that. But how are we targeting the parent, which should be the first advocate for the child, which should be the first educator? Are there programs in North Carolina that do offer this education to the parents directly, since that's kind of where childhood development should start?
I totally agree with you. We are working with community-based organizations. As I said, the grant that we're doing, some of that are schools, but we do have a lot of community-based organizations. But we're looking for more partnerships, more collaboration, so that we can work with parenting programs. One of the things that we're doing a lot of work around now is fatherhood programs. You know, and Jim and I were talking about, and his wife were talking at lunch today about, you know, fathers being in the home. But one of the things that we really stress at a call to men, we definitely want fathers to be in the home, but we want to be there in a very healthy way. We say, when we talk about manhood at a call to men, we talk about healthy and respectful manhood. So how do we show up healthy? That's looking internally, because we know when we think about violence against women and girls, we know that domestic sexual violence is hurting and killing women and girls. but it's also hurting and killing us as men. When we think about how it's impacting us, when we think about our mental health, and oftentimes even our physical health, because those of us who do go to the doctors on a regular basis, the reason that we do is because who we partner with. So when we think about that, how it's impacting our mental health, our physical health, it's hurting us too. So that's why it's so important to talk about manhood, but in a healthy way, in a respectful way, but also talk about fatherhood. So we're trying to partner with fatherhood programs, and would love to do some work with early childhood development programs. One of the organizations I used to partner with earlier was called, gosh, I just forgot the name of it. It was Baby Fast. It was families and schools together. Anybody know that program? But it was working with teenage moms and teenage fathers, and it was really trying to teach them that, the child comes first, how that we can work through our, our own issues in order to center the baby. And so that was one of the things that I worked with teenage fathers with, was really being there, but being there in a healthy way.
More of a statement, but I encourage you to, if you agree or disagree, to please comment. There's been a couple of people now that have asked questions about, how do we get this education in place? Myself and Nikki were talking about the struggles of trying to get into the school systems in various parts of the state. So, obviously as a police chief, I can tell you firsthand, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, okay? If city council or the mayor's office is getting a lot of complaints about speeding in a certain neighborhood, I promise you the expectation is going to be that I deploy resources in that neighborhood to curb speeding. I think we can all agree that this is a lot more serious than speeders in the neighborhood, right? So I would encourage you all to go back to your communities and talk to your police chiefs, schedule an appointment with them, tell them that you're concerned about this, tell them that you want them to bring resources into the community, into the church systems, into the civic organizations, into the scouting programs, wherever it is that young people are at, that you want the police department to support an education program. There are plenty of them out there. They don't even have to invent one. They can just literally just Google human trafficking education for 12-year-old and you'll get everything that you need. Go to the mayor's office, go to your city council member and let them know this is something that we want our police department to engage in. And if you do that, I can guarantee you that you'll go from seeing very little engagement in this aspect to a lot of engagement in that aspect. Ricky, would you, based on areas that you've seen where you guys have been called in to kind of bring your message, you've seen that it's very much been driven by the community in a lot of cases?
As Tony said earlier, most of the time we get invited in is women-led organizations that invite us in. And oftentimes when it's around domestic violence or sexual violence, too often it's after an incident has already occurred. I was at a college campus back in September on the West Coast, and it was because of incidents of sexual violence that had taken place, on that team's football team. But I totally agree with you is that if we can get community together and we go and talk with police chief, I live in Wilmington, North Carolina. Our police chief is we have his ear. They have the Police Athletic League. And one of the, actually deputy chief runs a program every other Saturday night, midnight basketball, where he's teaching curriculum to kids, where he's working with kids. And so finding ways to have, police chief where you can have that conversation, but also get in city council's ear, get into elected officials' ear and beginning the conversation. But too often we wait till an incident has already has taken place, and then we're very reactionary. And I'm just going to be honest. The fire burns for about 6 months, and things begin to calm down, and we're right back to the same place. But how do we get to the place, where when Chief sees me coming, he's like, oh, I know what Rick's coming to talk about. We get to the place where that we grab these issues, that when Chief sees me, we come talk about another issue, or either talk about how well it's doing now. But we've got to grab on to. I'm clergy, so I'm going to go scripture here in a minute. So if anybody's offended, I do not apologize. Do not grow weary in well-doing. Okay? Do not grow weary in well-doing. Because you can't, because if you faint, you reap not. So we can't grow weary. We got to stick to it. Appreciate that, Chief. We've got, superintendent's door, we lost a school principal who said, I want your curriculum for all my 9th grade boys. He said, because all of them are at risk. That's the kind of thinking that we need to have, when we're not just targeting a certain group, but everybody needs the education.
Very good. I like that too, that scripture. All right, so it officially is now, right? Okay, time for a break. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris. But thank you, panelists,
Thank you.
and sharing your expertise with us.